The storm rolled in over Lisbon like a living creature, swallowing the last traces of twilight beneath a blanket of roiling black clouds. Wind ripped through the narrow alleys of Alfama, rattling loose shutters and bending iron balconies until they moaned in protest. Rain fell in violent sheets, slashing sideways, as if the sky itself had lost all patience. At the base of one of the district's twisting stairways, beneath the overhang of an abandoned fado bar, sat a man who looked like he had been carved out of the shadows themselves. His name was Rafael Silva, though few knew it, and fewer still cared. His coat, once fine enough to pass him through elite business halls without a second glance, was now frayed and heavy with dampness. His dark hair clung to his forehead in tangled strands, and the stubble on his jaw had grown into a rough beard that aged him beyond his years. The world had moved on without him long ago, and he had done little to stop it. The tourists who normally swarmed the district's picturesque overlooks had vanished with the first crack of thunder, scrambling into taxis and cafes, leaving the old city to the storm. Raphael watched the empty street with the vacant stare of someone who had trained himself not to expect anything meaningful from the world, neither kindness nor cruelty, only the predictable repetition of hunger, cold, and anonymity. His breathing formed faint clouds in the frigid air, each exhale a reminder of a life he had once lived and no longer understood how to reclaim. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the tempest drown out the noise inside his own mind. It was a noise that never stopped, echoes of boardrooms, signatures on contracts, polite applause from investors, the sterile click of heels on marble floors, and finally, the shattering silence that had consumed him the day everything collapsed. But even the storm couldn't drown out memory completely. It only muffled it enough to let him breathe. Then, unexpectedly, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. Not thunder, not the hiss of rain against stone. A voice, sharp, frightened, and breaking apart. Raphael opened his eyes and turned his head slowly. Halfway down the slippery staircase, struggling to cling to a railing that offered little stability, was a woman who looked as though the world had abruptly pulled the floor out from under her. She wore a cream-colored coat, now stained with water and dirt, and her hair clung to her cheeks in wet curls. One of her shoes was missing. Her suitcase lay open at the bottom of the stairs, its contents scattered across the steps and already beginning to drift in the cascading rainwater. She muttered something in Italian. Raphael recognized the cadence, if not every word, and then she burst into a sob that shook her entire frame. She dropped to her knees, clutching at a stack of documents that were quickly dissolving into pulp in her hands. The wind whipped more papers from her grasp, carrying them up the narrow street before plastering them against a graffiti-covered wall. She scrambled after them on hands and knees, frantic and disoriented. No one else appeared. No one called out to her. No one slowed their pace to help. The storm had emptied the streets of witnesses, leaving only Raphael, who watched her with the pained recognition of someone who had once crumbled in daylight and been ignored by everyone except the memories that refused to leave him alone. For several minutes he didn't move. He didn't trust himself to. When you spend years convincing the world to see through you, helping someone feels like breaking a vow you made for your own survival. But as she crawled across the slick stones, he saw something in her expression that pierced straight through the fog of his isolation. It wasn't simply fear or shock. It was a deeper devastation, raw and ancient, the kind of grief that came from losing something that once held you together. He pushed himself up slowly, feeling the cold stiffness in his joints. The storm immediately attacked him with its full force, but he barely noticed as he stepped out from beneath the overhang. He approached her with measured steps so she wouldn't startle. The woman didn't see him at first. She was trying to gather the papers that were disintegrating faster than she could save them. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, just long enough for Raphael to see how young she was, mid-20s perhaps, and how completely overwhelmed. When she finally looked up, her eyes widened in surprise at the sight of the bedraggled stranger hovering near her belongings. For a split second, fear flickered across her face. Fear of him, fear of the situation, fear of everything collapsing around her at once. But Raphael simply knelt beside her without a word. He began gathering the scattered items with a carefulness that felt foreign to his calloused hands, as though he were touching fragile shards of glass. A scarf, a passport, a notebook with smeared ink, a small velvet box that he handed to her without opening. The woman blinked through her tears, clearly unsure what to make of him, but she didn't pull away. She watched him silently as he repacked her suitcase, his movements deliberate and oddly elegant for someone dressed in rags. She finally whispered, in accented English, "Thank you. I don't know what happened. My flight was cancelled and then my meeting. My whole day fell apart." Raphael said nothing. He simply zipped the suitcase shut and stepped back, letting her gather herself. She wiped her eyes with the back of her trembling hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ruin your night." Raphael gave a small shake of his head. "You didn't," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. It surprised her. She looked at him more closely, studying his face in the fleeting lamplight. He saw the moment she realized he wasn't simply a passer-by or a fellow traveler. Her gaze flicked to his torn coat, his worn shoes, the dampness clinging to his unkempt hair. He braced himself for the recoil, for the polite but unmistakable distance people placed between themselves and someone like him. But she didn't recoil. She breathed in shakily, looked at his face again and said, "You helped me when no one else did." Raphael didn't know what to do with that, so he said nothing. "Please," she added, voice cracking, "let me at least buy you something warm to eat." He opened his mouth to refuse, out of habit, out of pride, out of fear, but she stepped toward him with such earnest sincerity that the refusal stuck in his throat like a stone. Before he could protest, she gently took his arm and guided him toward the nearest cafe whose lights were still on. The owner nearly turned them away the moment he saw Raphael, his expression tightening in familiar disdain. But the woman, whose name Raphael still didn't know, spoke with quiet determination that cut through the storm's roar. Something in her tone made the owner relent, if reluctantly. Inside, the cafe was warm and nearly empty, the aroma of roasted coffee and wet stone blending into something oddly comforting. She ordered 2 soups and 2 coffees, then sat across from Raphael, as though sitting with him were the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't until the steaming bowls arrived that she finally said, "My name is Lucia Romano." Raphael stiffened almost imperceptibly. He knew that name. Deep in his memory, buried beneath years of misery and self-imposed exile, Romano struck a chord he had deliberately tried to forget. But Lucia continued talking, unaware of the way his pulse had begun to race. "My family runs a chain of event venues and cultural centers across Europe," she said. "I'm supposed to take over someday. But She broke off, staring into her soup as though it held the answers she was afraid to face. "I'm not sure I want any of it. And after today, I just feel like everything is falling apart." Raphael listened in silence, but inside, his mind churned. The Romano family. He had known her grandfather. He had worked with him once, long before Raphael Silva became a ghost, haunting the edges of Lisbon. 100 memories stirred, pushing at the edges of his carefully maintained numbness. But he said nothing, not yet. Lucia looked up at him, her expression gentler now. "What's your name?" Raphael hesitated. Then, softly, he said, "Raphael." He didn't offer the rest. Not the full name, not the legacy, not the downfall. Lucia didn't press him. She simply nodded. For a moment, the storm outside seemed less violent. Or maybe it was Raphael who felt something within himself quiet for the first time in years. He didn't know then that Lucia had unwittingly stepped into the deepest chapters of a story he thought he had buried forever. He didn't know that mentioning her family name had opened a door he had once slammed shut. And he certainly didn't know that the path ahead of them would unravel truths both of them had spent years avoiding. He only knew one thing with certainty. He should walk away before anything could begin. But he didn't. He stayed. And the consequences of that choice were already in motion, weaving their way through the rain-soaked streets of Lisbon toward the 2 people who had no idea how profoundly their lives were about to collide. The rain had weakened by the time Raphael and Lucia stepped back into the street, though the sky still hung heavy with clouds that threatened to open again at any moment. The storm drains gurgled under the force of water rushing through them, carrying with it dust, leaves, fragments of paper, and the remnants of a city that had weathered centuries of tempests. Lucia held her repaired suitcase close, as if it were a shield against the world, while Raphael shoved his hands into his pockets, his shoulders instinctively curling inward the way they did whenever he found himself too visible. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" she asked gently. Raphael nodded before he thought better of it. "I manage," he said, and the shallowness of the answer made her frown, though she didn't press further. She wasn't naive. She could see the truth in the way he avoided her gaze, in the way his voice dropped the moment he felt too exposed. They walked together down the slick stones of Rua dos Remedios, neither speaking for several minutes. Lucia's breathing was no longer shaky, but Raphael noticed she kept glancing sideways at him, her brows pinched with a quiet curiosity. Eventually, she stopped at a small awning that protected the entrance of a guest house. The light above the door flickered, casting unsteady shadows across her face. "This is where I'm staying," she said. I wanted to thank you again, really. Tonight could have been a lot worse without your help." Raphael looked down, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said softly. "They wouldn't have." Something in her tone struck him, but he didn't know how to hold it. He nodded once awkwardly and stepped back as if putting distance between them would help him breathe. Lucia hesitated, then added, "If you ever need anything, or if you'd just like a warm meal again, you can come here and ask for me. I mean it." Her sincerity pressed against the walls he had built around himself. For a moment he saw his reflection in the glass door behind her, ragged, worn, nearly unrecognizable from the man he had once been. He wanted to tell her not to place kindness where it didn't belong, that she didn't know who she was offering it to, but the words tangled in his throat. "Good night, Raphael," she said, and disappeared inside. He stood in the rain until the door shut completely, watching the faint glow of the reception area fade from view. Then he turned and walked the opposite direction, toward the labyrinth of alleys where the tourists never went. His footsteps echoed in the narrow corridors, mixing with the distant hum of the Tagus River and the rustle of laundry lines whipping in the wind. He could have found dry shelter beneath an abandoned train overpass near Santa Apollonia, where other homeless men gathered for the night. He could have headed toward the soup kitchen run by an elderly priest who overlooked the fact that Raphael never took more than one small serving. But instead, he wandered the maze of streets aimlessly, lost in thoughts he didn't want to revisit. Lucia Romano. The name pulsed in his mind like a distant alarm. Her grandfather, Matteo Romano, had once been one of the few figures in the European cultural sector who genuinely believed in nurturing young talent. He had funded Raphael's first architectural project, a small community center built from recycled materials in Porto, long before Raphael became the prodigy whose designs redefined sustainable urban development across continents. Matteo had believed in him before anyone else did, and Raphael had repaid him by destroying everything. No, he corrected himself sharply, forcing the memory back down. He hadn't destroyed Matteo. He had destroyed himself. The collateral damage was just another wound he didn't allow himself to examine anymore. But now Matteo's granddaughter had stumbled directly into his path, carrying with her the echoes of a world he had abandoned, a world that still had the power to unravel him. Lucia didn't sleep that night. She lay on the stiff mattress of her small guesthouse room staring at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in scattered fragments. She kept seeing Raphael's face, gentle yet weary, intelligent yet burdened, kind in a way that didn't match his circumstances. She also kept seeing something else, recognition. When she mentioned her family name, something had changed in his expression. It had been subtle, so subtle the average person would have missed it, but Lucia had spent her life watching powerful men react to the word Romano. Some flinched, some smirked, some became opportunistic, but Raphael's reaction had been different. It wasn't calculation, it wasn't intimidation, it was memory. She tried to shake the thought away as she showered, but curiosity lingered like an ache beneath her ribs. She told herself not to get involved. She told herself she had her own problems to deal with. But the storm had cracked something open inside her, and now she couldn't close it. By dawn, she was sitting at her small desk with her laptop open, searching through old archives of Romano cultural holdings. She didn't know what she was looking for until she found it. A photograph, a handshake, a smiling Matteo standing beside a younger man with bright eyes and confident posture. A man named Rafael Costa Silva, CEO and founder of Silva Arcology Group, one of the most celebrated sustainable urban development firms of the previous decade. A visionary, a public speaker, a favorite at international summits. He had given TED Talks about equitable city planning. He had designed groundbreaking projects across the world from São Paulo to Seoul, and then a headline dated 7 years earlier. Silva Arcology Group collapses after tragic accident. CEO missing. Lucia felt her heart pound painfully as she clicked the article. It detailed the death of Raphael's wife, Carolina, in a structural failure accident during the unveiling of one of his company's new experimental buildings. The collapse had killed 11 people. Raphael had been the one who insisted on pushing the construction schedule forward, despite warnings from engineers. Public outrage had consumed him overnight. He had resigned, liquidated his assets, shut down every branch of the company, and vanished without explanation. Investigators searched for him for months. Some speculated he had fled the country. Others suggested suicide. Eventually, the story lost traction, replaced by the next scandal, the next tragedy, the next news cycle. But Lucia stared at the photograph, comparing the eyes of the man in the suit to the man who had helped her gather her things in the rain. Same eyes, same shape, same look of someone carrying the weight of a world that had once been his to shape. She covered her mouth with her hand. My God, she had met him by accident. Or maybe fate was not as random as people like to believe. Raphael spent the early morning hours sitting on a stone ledge overlooking the river, his coat wrapped tightly around him as he watched ferries glide across the Tagus. The water shimmered faintly under the first hints of sunrise, streaked with shades of lavender and pale gold. Fishermen were beginning their day, their voices carrying faintly through the damp air. He didn't know why he had come here. He hadn't visited this spot in years. Too many memories, too many ghosts. Carolina had loved watching the sunrise from this exact ledge, once telling him that the river was the only place in Lisbon where time felt honest. He clenched his jaw and forced the memory away. The storm had left debris scattered everywhere. Branches, cardboard, someone's broken umbrella, a child's rain boot carried by the currents from somewhere upstream. Raphael watched the river mindlessly, but his thoughts kept returning to Lucia. He should not have gone inside the cafe. He should not have given her his name, even part of it. He should have walked away when she thanked him. He should have done what he always did, disappear before anyone noticed he was there. But he hadn't, because something in her voice reminded him of himself before the fall. Something in her eyes carried a pain he recognized intimately, painfully, and because deep down he had forgotten what it felt like to be treated as a human being rather than a burden or a warning sign. He closed his eyes, inhaling the cold morning air. He needed to disappear again before she uncovered the truth, before she connected the dots, before she saw him not as the man who helped her, but as the man who destroyed countless lives with one unforgivable decision. Before she asked him the question he feared most, why did you run? He pushed himself to his feet, intending to slip back into the anonymity of the old city. But as he turned, he found someone standing several steps away. Sister Helena, the elderly nun who ran the soup kitchen he frequented. Her posture was small but unyielding, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her weathered cardigan. Her keen eyes studied him with the perceptiveness of someone who had spent her life seeing through people's armor. You're up early, she said. Raphael shrugged. Couldn't sleep. You rarely do. He didn't answer. She stepped closer, her shoes crunching on wet gravel. Someone came looking for you. Ice shot down Raphael's spine. Who? A young woman, Italian I think, thin, curly hair, looked worried, not frightened. Lucia. He tried to keep his voice steady. What did she want? To thank you. Sister Helena paused. And to talk. That's not necessary. No, she agreed, but it seems important to her. Raphael rubbed the back of his neck. His pulse thudded painfully. Did you tell her where to find me? I told her I would pass along any message she left. And did she? Sister Helena reached into her cardigan and pulled out a sealed envelope. Raphael didn't take it. Please, she said softly, at least read what she has to say. He hesitated. For a long moment he simply stared at the envelope as though it were a live wire. Then reluctantly he accepted it. Sister Helena placed a hand on his arm. Whatever this young woman wants from you, it is not your past. It is your presence. You don't know that. I know broken souls, she said. And I know when two of them cross paths at the exact moment they need to. He said nothing, unable to meet her gaze. I'll leave you to it, she whispered, and moved away. Raphael remained frozen until she disappeared around the bend of the street. Only then did he sit back down on the ledge and open the envelope with trembling fingers. It was a single page, neatly folded. Her handwriting was elegant, but unsteady, as though she had written quickly and with a heart that beat too fast. He read every word, his eyes moving slowly, absorbing each line like a blow to the chest. I know who you are. The sentence hit him like a physical strike. He kept reading. I know what happened to your company and to your wife. I found the articles, the photos. I know why you disappeared." His vision blurred as shame surged through him. "But I also know what it feels like to lose everything at once. And I don't want answers to satisfy my curiosity. I want to understand how you kept breathing afterward. I want to understand how someone survives that much heartbreak." His hands shook violently. He had spent years being invisible, years refusing connection, years convincing himself that he deserved nothing but isolation. And now, "Please meet me tonight at the same cafe, not because I pity you, but because I think our stories are tangled in ways that could matter for both of us." He closed his eyes. Lucia's signature was at the bottom. Raphael let out a long, shuddering breath. He wanted to tear the letter apart. He wanted to throw it into the river. He wanted to disappear into Lisbon's forgotten corners where no one could find him. But he didn't. He folded the letter carefully, pressed it against his forehead, and whispered something so quietly the wind stole it before it reached the air. That night, as the city lights flickered on one by one, Raphael stood across the street from the cafe, hidden in the shadows. Lucia was already inside, sitting at the same small table they had shared before. She kept checking her watch, her knee bouncing nervously under the table. Raphael stayed in the darkness for a full hour, torn between instinct and longing, between fear and something he dared not name. When he finally crossed the street, his steps were hesitant, almost clumsy. His fingers curled into fists inside his pockets. He stepped through the door and stood there, silent, dripping rainwater onto the tiles. Lucia looked up, her breath caught. Raphael met her gaze for the first time without hiding. And then he walked toward her, because some truths, once opened, could not be closed again. The alleys of Alfama twisted like veins beneath the storm, narrow paths carved long before cars existed, long before the city imagined men fleeing in the dark from forces they barely understood. Water poured down the staircases in thin rivers. Clotheslines snapped in the wind. Old lamps swayed dangerously, casting gold halos that flickered with every gust. Raphael ran with Lucia's hand, locked firmly in his, guiding her through corridors so tight they forced their shoulders sideways. His memories of the district, learned during the months he had wandered its shadows, were the only reason he knew where to go, which turns would lead to dead ends, which stairs were too worn to trust. Behind them, the engines grew louder. Lucia kept pace surprisingly well, despite the water soaking her clothes, despite the panic in her breathing. "Raphael," she gasped. "Who are these people? Why are they coming after me?" "I don't know yet," he answered. He didn't dare tell her the truth, that he recognized the tactical pattern of the approaching vehicles, the type of off-the-books pursuit Atrium Europa once employed to intimidate competitors, whistleblowers, and inconvenient allies. "But I know who they used to work for." She stumbled slightly. "My family?" "No." His jaw tightened. "Me." Lightning ripped across the sky, illuminating their path for one terrifying moment. They reached a fork, one path sloping down toward the riverfront, the other climbing steeply toward the older rooftops. Raphael made the call instantly. "Up!" Lucia didn't question him. They climbed the slick stone steps, nearly slipping more than once, water rushing past their ankles. The storm howled like something alive, echoing between the tightly packed houses. As they reached a small landing between two buildings, Raphael pulled her into a recessed doorway, pressing her back against the wooden frame. He raised a hand to silence her. Down the staircase they had just climbed, two dark figures appeared silhouetted against the dim streetlights. They moved with purpose. Not the casual stride of locals, not the uncertain caution of tourists. This was trained movement, coordinated, predatory. Lucia's eyes widened, breath shallow. Raphael leaned in close, voice barely above the rain. "They're tracking. We need to lose them before they triangulate our route." "Triangulate?" she whispered. "Raphael, what kind of life did you live?" He almost answered. Almost. But footsteps cut him off. The two figures paused at the landing. One knelt to inspect the rain-drenched stones. The other scanned the upper levels. Lucia squeezed Raphael's hand without realizing it. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The storm roared, drowning out everything except the pounding of blood in their ears. Finally, the kneeling figure stood. He pointed downhill. They moved. Lucia sagged against the door in relief. Raphael didn't relax. "They're not fooled," he said quietly. "Only repositioning. Then what do we do?" We go higher. He led her through another maze of alleys, each turn chosen with the instinct of a man who had once been hunted and learned the patterns of pursuit by surviving them. But as they climbed, the rain intensified, turning the ancient stones into slick traps. Several rooftops connected by low sloping tiles came into view. Raphael guided Lucia toward a metal ladder bolted to a wall. "We're climbing?" she asked, breathless. "They won't expect it. And if we fall?" "We won't." She stared up at the ladder, then down at the alley. "I'm beginning to think you have too much confidence in me." Raphael met her eyes, even drenched, exhausted, terrified. She didn't break. She was stronger than she believed. "Trust me," he said simply, and she did. She climbed first, hands trembling, boots slipping once or twice, but Raphael stayed close behind, steadying her without touching unless necessary. When they reached the rooftop, the wind hit them with full force, nearly knocking Lucia sideways. She grabbed Raphael's arm instinctively. "Stay low," he instructed. They crawled across the tiles, keeping their bodies pressed close to the roof. Beneath them, the alleys stretched like a labyrinth drawn in shadow and stormlight. From this vantage, Raphael could see the SUVs repositioning, two heading toward the river, one circling toward the east, another blocking the main road. A full sweep. Damn. They weren't looking for mere leverage. They were hunting. Lucia shivered violently beside him. "Raphael, why me?" He swallowed hard. "I'm not sure yet, but it's tied to Atrium, my father's partner company." "Not exactly." He scanned the streets. "Atrium Europa is only the face. There's a unit inside it, covert, unlisted in any records, handled by a group of executives who profit from operations no one should ever approve." Lucia stared at him. "And you worked with them?" "Not knowingly," Raphael said, "but when I found out, I tried to expose them." She inhaled sharply. "What happened?" He looked at the storm-dark horizon. Everything collapsed. This time, she understood a little more of what that meant. Before she could speak, a shout echoed from below. Raphael jerked his head toward the sound. One of the figures was in the alley beneath them, scanning the rooftops with a tactical flashlight. "Move," Raphael whispered. They crossed the roof, climbing over a small chimney and slipping onto a lower level. The tiles trembled beneath their feet. Lucia slipped, and Raphael caught her waist, steadying her. For a second their faces were inches apart, breaths mixing, rain running down their cheeks like tears that didn't belong to either of them. "Careful," he murmured. She nodded, eyes searching his for reassurance she was too afraid to admit she needed. They continued to the far edge of the building. Below was a narrow courtyard, a dead end. But to the left a wooden balcony extended from an old apartment, its railing warped but intact. Raphael crouched, gauging the distance. Lucia's gaze followed his. "No," she whispered. "Raphael, we can't jump that." "We don't have to." He tapped the ceramic gutter running along the edge of the roof. "We shimmy across." She looked at the gutter, then at him, then at the drop. "Raphael, that can't possibly hold." "It will." "You don't know that." "I do," he said, a note of urgency threading through his voice. "I lived here, Lucia. I know every gutter and every loose tile in this district." She stared at him, stunned. He had lived here. He hadn't said it before. He hadn't needed to. Because it was obvious now, this wasn't a route he was improvising. It was muscle memory, survival instinct, the practiced knowledge of a man who had learned to disappear in this very maze. "You first," he said. Lucia hesitated only a moment before gripping the gutter's edge and sliding herself along the wall, feet skimming the tiles. Wind whipped her hair wildly, rain stinging her eyes, but she moved with growing determination. Halfway across, a loud crack split the air. Lucia froze. "Raphael," she whispered, terror rising. "Something broke." "It's just the bracket shifting," he lied. "Keep going." Another flash of lightning lit the courtyard below. A shadow moved. Someone had spotted them. "Lucia," Raphael said sharply. "Go!" She pushed herself harder, reaching the balcony railing. Raphael was only steps behind when the gutter finally gave way, metal screeching as it pulled loose from the wall. Lucia screamed, grabbing Raphael's wrist at the last second. He swung, momentum pulling them both toward the balcony. Raphael slammed into the railing shoulder first, pain shooting down his arm. Lucia clung to him desperately as the gutter piece fell into the courtyard below with a metallic crash. Raphael hauled them both onto the balcony, chest heaving with adrenaline. Lucia collapsed to her knees, covering her face. "Oh God! Oh God!" He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did well. I almost fell. But you didn't," he said firmly. Her breathing steadied slightly. A shout rose from the courtyard. Lights swung upward. Raphael stood and pulled Lucia up. "We need to move." They entered the apartment through a cracked balcony door. The room was dark, dusty, long abandoned. Lucia wiped her face. "Where now?" Raphael listened to the footsteps closing in. "We can't outrun them in the open." "Then what do we do?" He exhaled slowly. "We stop running." Lucia stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," Raphael said, voice low, "that if Atrium wants you, we need to know why. And there's only one person in this city who can tell us." "Who?" Raphael met her gaze. "Someone I hoped never to see again." She swallowed. "And we trust this person?" "No," Raphael replied. "But we need him." Shadows moved on the balcony outside. The apartment door rattled. Raphael grabbed Lucia's hand. "Come on." They crossed the room and disappeared into the stairwell, boots thundering down the old steps as the storm raged on, merciless, electric, swallowing the city whole. They descended the narrow stairwell in near darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of a failing bulb. The walls were damp, covered in cracked tiles painted decades earlier, their colors now ghostly in the storm-filtered gloom. Each step creaked under their weight, and each sound echoed strangely, as if the building itself were holding its breath. On the second landing, Raphael stopped abruptly. Lucia crashed into his back. "What is it?" He pointed at the floor, at the muddy footprints leading downward. "Fresh, recent, too many." "They're already inside," he whispered. Lucia's eyes widened. "How?" "We were ahead of them. They split up." He scanned the shadows below. "Atrium trained some of their people well, better than I realized. Then we go up, back to the roof." "No." He shook his head. "They'll have someone watching the roofline by now. They know we tried to escape over the tiles." "Then what? What choice do we have?" Raphael turned toward a rusted metal door on the third landing. "Here." He pushed it open with his shoulder. The hinges groaned, revealing a storage room piled with broken furniture, old paint cans, and thick sheets of dust. But at the back of the room, hidden behind a collapsed wardrobe, was a small door, wooden, swollen from years of humidity. Lucia stared at it. "Where does that go?" Raphael didn't answer immediately. He pushed aside the wardrobe, wiped grime from the handle, and leaned close, listening. Silence. "It leads to an old maintenance shaft," he finally said, "from when these buildings used to share a central heating system. Is it safe?" He took a breath. "Not really. But it's hidden. And narrow. Extremely." She swallowed but nodded. "Then let's go." He admired that. Her courage wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, trembling, but real. They entered the storage room and shut the door behind them. The noise from the stairwell grew louder. Voices now, sharp commands, the unmistakable metallic click of weapons being checked. Raphael turned the maintenance door's handle. It stuck. He pressed harder. Nothing. Lucia's breathing hitched. "Raphael." He threw his shoulder into it. The wood cracked. He hit it again. A splintering sound. A small gap opened near the hinge. "Again," Lucia whispered, urging him. He slammed his weight into it one final time, and the door burst inward, dust exploding into the air in a choking cloud. The shaft beyond was pitch black. Raphael grabbed Lucia's hand and guided her inside. The space was barely wide enough for them to move sideways. Metal pipes lined the walls, some dripping cold water. The air smelled of rust and damp stone. Raphael closed the door gently, praying the darkness would mask its broken frame. Outside, the stairwell filled with footsteps. Lucia squeezed his hand. They were pressed so close in the narrow passage that he could feel her trembling. He placed his free hand on the cold wall, guiding them deeper. "We have to move quietly," he whispered. "They can't know this exists." Lucia nodded, though he could barely see the motion. They inched forward. The shaft sloped downward, then to the left. Raphael's memories pieced together faint details. He had used this passage once, months ago, when hiding from a group of street thieves who hunted the homeless through Alfama's back streets like sport. The memory wasn't pleasant, but it told him one thing. The shaft led somewhere they could breathe again. Behind them, the storage room door crashed open. Light flooded in through the cracks around the maintenance door. Lucia stiffened. "They're in the room." Raphael pressed a finger to her lips, barely touching her. Voices muttered, shuffling, searching. A flashlight beam swept across the storage room. The maintenance door rattled. Lucia's throat tightened with fear. Raphael gripped her hand so tightly she felt the bones shift. The door rattled again, and again a man cursed. "This thing's jammed, not worth it. Let's sweep the next floor." Another voice agreed. Boots retreated. Silence returned. Lucia exhaled shakily, leaning her forehead against Raphael's chest for a moment that felt heavier than the storm itself. "We're okay," he whispered. But truthfully, they weren't. Not yet. Not even close. They continued through the shaft, inch by inch, until the narrow passage opened into a slightly wider service corridor. Still cramped, still dark, but passable. At the end of the corridor was a metal grate. Raphael knelt, bracing his shoulder, and pushed. The grate groaned. He pushed again. It popped free and clattered onto wet cement. Cold air rushed in. They stepped out into a steep street overlooking the river. The storm still raged, but the open space felt like a blessing after the suffocating confines of the shaft. Lucia hugged herself, shivering. "Where are we?" "Rua dos Remedios," Raphael said. "We're close." "Close to who?" He looked down the hill, toward a cluster of dimly lit windows across from a small fado bar where mournful singing echoed into the night. "To the only man who knows why Atrium wants you." His voice hardened. "And why they used my name to draw you in." Lucia froze. "Your name?" Raphael nodded grimly. "Your father's email wasn't an accident. Atrium planted it. They wanted you here. With me. But why? We'll find out." He took her hand again, not because they needed to run, but because she was shaking violently, and he wanted her to feel anchored to something solid. They descended toward the building with the lit windows. A faded sign hung crooked above the door. Armando Levi, Consultoria and Archivos. Lucia read the name. "He's a consultant?" Raphael let out a dry exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. "Not exactly. He used to work for Atrium's intelligence wing. He knows every secret they buried." "And you trust him?" "No," Raphael said, "but he owes me." Lightning cracked overhead as they approached the door. Raphael knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 times more, a pattern he hadn't used in years. For a moment nothing happened. Then a voice emerged, muffled. "If you're selling religion or insurance, I already have both." "Armando," Raphael called quietly. "It's me." Silence. Then the sound of locks. Many locks being undone. The door creaked open. A small man in a wrinkled sweater and wireframe glasses peered out, his grey hair wild, his expression sour. "If you wanted to die tonight, Raphael, there are simpler ways." Raphael stepped inside, pulling Lucia with him. Armando locked the door in frantic fashion, muttering under his breath. "You brought company," he said sharply, eyeing Lucia with surprising perceptiveness. "And trouble. Big trouble." Lucia straightened her posture, despite her trembling. "My name—" "I know who you are," Armando cut in. "Lucia Martel, daughter of the executive Atrium once silenced. Congratulations, your life expectancy just plummeted." Raphael stepped between them. "Enough. Tell me why they're after her." Armando's eyes flicked toward the window. "Because her father found out." "Found out what?" "That Atrium's environmental division has been laundering money through offshore humanitarian projects. Millions, maybe billions. And someone close to your father was ready to leak proof." Lucia shook her head. "But why involve me? Why drag Raphael into it?" Armando turned to her. "Because your father refused to play along. Atrium needed leverage. And Raphael?" He pointed at the man beside her. "He's the perfect ghost. A disgraced former director who vanished from the map. Exactly the kind of scapegoat they can blame for everything." Lucia stared at Raphael, stunned. "You? You were a director?" Raphael looked away. "I told you. I didn't know the truth until it was too late." Armando snorted. "Atrium knows you care about the Martel family. They leaked your old clearance code to Lucia's father, knowing she would come looking for answers. And when she did, well, they could frame the narrative however they wanted." Lucia's voice cracked. "So I was bait," Armando shrugged. "Essentially." Raphael clenched his fists. "And what do they want now?" "To erase both of you," Armando said flatly. "Clean up the mess before the leak goes public." Lucia felt her legs weaken. Raphael guided her to a nearby chair. Armando rummaged through a stack of folders and pulled out a thin envelope. "I've been tracking them for years." They don't forgive betrayal, and they don't like loose ends. Armando, Raphael said slowly, what aren't you telling me? The older man paused, then sighed. There's something else, something you need to see. He pulled out a photograph. Lucia's eyes widened. Raphael went still, because the photograph showed a document signed by several Atrium executives, authorizing covert financial operations across multiple continents. At the bottom of the document, one signature stood out. Lucia traced it with trembling fingers. My father. Armando nodded. He didn't sign knowingly. They forged it. But if this goes public, the world will think he ran the entire scheme. Lucia's voice shook. They're going to destroy him. No, Raphael said. We won't let them. Armando raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan to fight a corporation with private intelligence units and government contracts? Raphael looked at Lucia. She met his gaze. And for the first time that night, something fierce, unbroken, and luminous sparked in her eyes. We don't run anymore, Lucia whispered. Raphael nodded. We expose them. Armando stared at the two of them, and for a moment his cynicism cracked, replaced by the faintest glimmer of respect. Then he exhaled. Well, in that case, you'd better sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything.